people who care about war and peace, climate change, reproductive rights, LGBTQ issues, racial and economic equality, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back.
Welcome to the Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. For 30 years, journalist Amy Goodman has gone to where the silence is to report stories that the powerful would rather you not know about and the corporate media has largely ignored. She has stared down armed soldiers in Nigeria, survived a massacre in East Timor, documented dogs attacking indigenous pipeline protesters in North Dakota, and been manhandled and arrested while covering the Republican National Convention. Amy is the co-founder and host of Democracy Now!, the fiercely independent daily news program, and I'm proud to say she's also my sister and media hero. She and I have also co-authored 4 best-selling books. Now, a new documentary film, Steal This Story Please, traces Amy's career and the growth of Democracy Now! From a radio broadcast on 9 stations into one of the leading U.S.-based independent daily news broadcasts in the world. The film is directed by Oscar-nominated filmmakers Carl Deal and Tia Lesson and is already winning numerous awards. This week, Steal This Story Please premieres in Vermont at sold-out screenings in Burlington, Brattleboro, St. Johnsbury, and Montpelier, followed by Q&As with Amy and Carl Deal that I will moderate. Amy and Democracy Now! Have been at the forefront of a tenacious independent media movement that continues to challenge the media conglomerates that are bending a knee to President Donald Trump. Here is the trailer for Steal This Story Please.
Hi, I'm Amy Goodman from Democracy Now!
I'm sorry, I'm running late for a meeting.
You weren't running late when you're just standing there, so...
My first impression, man, she doesn't care what anybody thinks.
We began on 9 radio stations.
She taught me to speak to those who are being deliberately silenced.
If she believes something, she's going to fight for it.
Independent media is the oxygen of a democracy.
The press is the enemy of the people.
We will not be silent.
Steal this story, please.
I caught up with Amy on Monday while she was in Ireland touring with Steal This Story Please. Amy Goodman, welcome back to the Vermont Conversation.
It's great to be with you, David Lloyd Goodman.
Okay, now you've given away the secret of my middle name. And 30 years ago, I remember you telling me that you were starting a new show covering the 1996 presidential election. And that's probably a Jeopardy question by now, but just to steal the answer, it's who is Clinton Gore versus Bob Dole and Ross Perot. You figured this was going to be a 10-month gig, an election show, and then you'd go back to being news director at WBAI, the legendary community radio station in New York City. So now there's a new documentary film about you and 30 years of Democracy Now! Called Steal This Story Please. So let's go back to 1996. What did you set out to do differently in presenting the news that wasn't being done?
Well, it's interesting. I got a call from Pacifica Radio. I was in Haiti at the time at a kind of underground house. And there were elections that were going on there. And people who went out to vote sometimes could be gunned down. People who declared for office could be killed. But they still did it. And the vast majority of people voted. When I got the call to host the only daily election show in public broadcasting, I thought, wow, people in the United States don't risk anything like that. And at the time, most people didn't vote. So why would I come back to do that? But I really was curious. I didn't think people were apathetic. I was curious, if we use the primary system, we go state by state and look at what were people doing in their community. And that's just what we did. And then we were packing up after the election because it was just a project of Pacifica Radio But there was more demand for the show after the election than before because of those authentic grassroots voices, right? We don't bring you the pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. We bring you the people closest to the story. And that authentic, real voice, especially for young people who sense authenticity, it just built an audience that was so devoted. Oh, and there was another thing. It was right at the beginning of the internet. And we couldn't afford the way other networks could to send out, it was before the word podcast, right? To send the MP3 out by satellites that you had to pay for. So we got this website, democracynow.org, on the intertubes, and we posted the MP3, and then radio stations could take it for free. But by doing that so early on, then people would transcribe the segments. There'd be, a person in Montana who would transcribe segment 1, just volunteering, a person in Mexico, segment 2, a person in California, segment 3. And then we had a transcription coordinator, and they would fix up the transcripts and they would be posted online. And David, this was so unusual. So it would, to say the least, like for searches and everything, we'd be right there because the transcripts would be there. And so you'd have network reporters bringing our transcripts to the State Department press briefings, the White House press briefings, the Pentagon press briefings, and they wouldn't be based on your typical pundits, but these real important voices describing their own experience. And because we're online, we had a global audience from the beginning. And because we are listener supported and now listener, reader, viewer supported, radio and TV, we had a donor base from the beginning that just grew. And I remember when Time Magazine, I think their first website, they spent something like $20 million on, and they immediately put up a paywall and it failed. Years later, we would ask a technical web person at Fox, interestingly, if he would just evaluate our website. He said, "Are you kidding? All the networks are looking at you guys. Necessity is the mother of invention." And this was our major form of communication. Of course, outside doing it on community radio and then community television, and then ultimately on PBS stations and NPR stations. So it, it just grew because we couldn't afford satellites.
Interesting. And the video you used to send around VHS tapes, right? By
That's
FedEx.
right. Well, the television show began regularly the week of 9/11, the week of the terror attacks. Democracy Now! Was then broadcasting from a 100-year-old firehouse, blocks from Ground Zero. We were the closest national broadcasts to the World Trade Center. And the first plane hit the first tower at 8:47. We broadcast the show now every morning at 8, but at the time it was 9. We didn't know what happened outside. It was like a kind of sonic boom-like sound. We started the show at 9 o'clock. The second plane hit the second tower at 9:03. And we just started reporting we didn't know, again, what had actually taken place. A plane had hit the tower, another plane had hit the other tower, and then we didn't stop broadcasting throughout that day, and stations would join us throughout the day, and soon people were running down the street covered in ash. The firehouse opens its doors to people to be able to make phone calls and to get a drink of water. And then I just didn't leave because we were within the evacuation zone. And I knew if I went past north of Canal Street, that that I wouldn't be allowed back in. The police wouldn't let me. So I just stayed at the firehouse. They had a hammock, and I would, at night, walk out around the pile. I would just check out what was happening in these ash covered streets. And late at night, just sleep in the hammock and broadcast the next day. Because I really felt it was critical to get out the voices of people who more reflected the feeling at the time. I mean, the rest of the media were beating the drums for war, but that wasn't the feeling. People were in shock. People were gathering in parks. They were holding candles. And then people started putting up, it's terrible, but the Xeroxes of the pictures of their loved ones. And it would say, if you've seen my wife last seen in Tower 1, please call her husband. Or if you've seen my son, please call his father. And, the show we were doing that we interrupted, we were doing a special that day on the connection between terror and September 11th, 1973, the day Salvador Allende died in the palace in Chile when the Pinochet forces rose to power, the US-backed Pinochet forces, the Nixon-backed, Kissinger-backed Pinochet forces rose to power, and thousands would die over the next 17 years. And we were looking at that date in history. So it was astounding to see what was taking place in New York. I think terror that day, 9/11, united us with people around the world against what was taking place.
Let me roll back the film a little bit because people think you got into this as a muckraking journalist, but I know, and Steal the Story now shows what your real dream was in journalism. You wanted to work for the Phil Donahue Show, a kind of forerunner to Oprah. Tell that story and also tell a little bit about what drew you to Phil Donahue. He was actually a lot more than just a lightweight daytime talk show host.
That's right, Dave. But I have to admit, I mean, you're so modest that you're not going to ask me to go further back. But I originally, when I was 10, wanted to work for Dave's Press. And that was your press. I think you were 8. And I did get to work for you. I was the one who dunned the family subscribers for
You were
money.
the business manager, yes.
It was a penny a year for your newspaper, Dave's Press. And that's all described in Steal a Story, Please. So I really hope people come out. I'm so excited to be with you at when this screens in Burlington and Montpelier and St. Johnsbury and Brattleboro, the weekend of Juneteenth. I can't wait to come up to Vermont. But
Well, let me just say, I have waited 60 years to go viral for Dave's Press. And I knew that someday the moment would come when Dave's Press would finally get the recognition it's deserved. Little did I know that it would be my business manager who did that. And by the way, there are some issues in which on the masthead, you are listed as being on strike. So we'll have to talk about what the working conditions were that you found so oppressive. And we'll leave that to the film Q&As.
oh my God, that's fantastic. Anyway, it was a wonderful way to start my journalistic aspirations, that my younger brother would be the one to inspire me. But we fought out the issues of the day, our entire extended family with our aunts, uncles, grandparents, and the letters to the editor page. And I'm giving away a little part of Steal the Story, Please. But Grandpa would write in and say, "Dear Devil," what he called you in Yiddish. I love you very much, but I disagree with your views on war. And you wrote back as the editor in chief of the paper, Dear Grandpa, thank you for being my first subscriber, but your views on war are stupid. And that was the kind of erudite analysis you would share with your readers. And that
Well,
really got me.
speaking truth to power was something that I like to think that we pioneered. Yes.
Well, let's just say I heard you speaking truth in the shower, but that's another story.
Okay.
But then we'll move forward from there. And yes, when I was in college and I lived right below you, you lived on the second floor. I lived on the first floor of our college dorm. And I used to watch the Phil Donahue show because I really was taken with Phil. Sure, he had a lot of, sensational shows, but he also dealt with a lot of very important issues early on. Whether he was talking about AIDS, one of the first to talk about it, or talking about nuclear weapons and having people on. I think his most frequent guest actually was Ralph Nader. But I was just glued to the set. I think it was mornings at 9 before class. And as you know, we lived with a man named Damon Payne, who was a World War II hobo, and he was squatting in our co-op. And he lived in one room on the first floor. I lived in the other, and we had a living room that had a black and white TV. And he smoked up a storm, and I forbade him to smoke during the show. I said, you can only smoke during commercials. I think it may be why I cough today, but no, I think that's 9/11. But anyway, as we were coming towards graduation, I told Damon, we didn't have TiVo or anything where you could roll back and, get the names of the credits. But I said, I have to get the name of every single person at the end of the show. Damon, if you could write down every other name, I'll write every other name and we'll gather this list. It took me weeks because he didn't cooperate. And I got all the names of all the credits at the end of the Phil Donahue show. And I sent them my, let's just say, very thin resume. And I told them I was looking forward to being Phil Donahue's producer. Clearly, they weren't impressed because they would actually call me a few weeks later after they got my resume, after 30 of them got my resume. I think it was a half a page. And they said, have you gotten a job yet? And I said, no. And they said, would you be able to join us tomorrow? I said, absolutely. Because at the time, we lived in Long Island and New York, and I would just, take the Long Island Railroad in. And they said, great, because we're doing a show on the unemployed and we'd like you to be in the audience. Well, let's just say I was devastated. But I thank Phil because that really led me to find what my life mission, my passion has been, and that is independent media. By the way, I want to tell you, years later, I was invited to speak in Dayton along with Phil Donahue. It's where he got his start, his first station. I just didn't even know what to say. I was so overwhelmed, and I got on the stage and I told that story. And then I introduced him. He came out of the stage, he hugged me, and he whispered in my ear, please never tell that story again. It is sadistic.
Oh my gosh. I thought you were going to say he laughed harder than anybody in the room.
No, he felt terrible. But I truly thank him because I found WBAI, which was Pacifica Radio, which was founded in 1949 by a war resister who said there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born, the first station, KPFA in Berkeley, 49, second station in Los Angeles, KPFK in 1959, my station in New York, WBAI in 1960, where James Baldwin would debate Malcolm X over the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, Jazz and Justice Radio, WPFW in Washington, and KPFT in Houston. And that was born in 1970. And in the Petro Metro, right? Houston, Texas. And within a few weeks, it was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. And when they got back on their feet a few weeks later, rebuilt the transmitter, the Klan strapped 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it up again, right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, which I thought was a good song. Anyway, then it took months. And January 1971, KPFT went back on the air. Arlo Guthrie came to Houston to finish Alice's Restaurant on the air live. And I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's an uncle in Afghanistan, it breaks down stereotypes and caricatures that fuel these hate groups. I mean, you may say, that sounds like my uncle, the uncle in Afghanistan. You might not even like your uncle, but it makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy him. The media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back.
One of the really moving parts in the film is, you're asked about where you got your approach from. You've talked a little bit about the family and Dave's press. But there's a whole other part, which is the role that your Jewish background, our Jewish background, has played in your approach. And there's a beautiful scene where you go to a young man's house in Brooklyn who asked to meet one of his idols or role models for his bar mitzvah. Talk about what that Jewish background, how it figures into your approach.
Well, that was Daniel Segan, and I didn't know him. He called the station and said he wanted to interview me for his bar mitzvah. And so I did go out to Brooklyn to his house, and he said he had chosen me as his hero and Billy Crystal as his role model. I only learned the Billy Crystal part when I got there.
That's some tough competition.
I can tell you. And I didn't realize it was competition. I thought we were in two different categories. But it's interesting you say that, David, because after we did this interview, when he asked me about what motivated me and what journalism meant, the family invited me to his bar mitzvah, and I was so proud. I mean, I was his hero, and I got there, and I was sitting with the family, and he gave his bar mitzvah speech, and he said, and so I've chosen Billy Crystal as my role model, and Amy as my hero, and now I have to really choose the one I most want to be like. I think I choose Billy Crystal. And there I was filming this whole thing. I go, what? Who's at the bar mitzvah? And who didn't show? I didn't know this was a competition. But he said that I worked too hard and he wanted a more relaxed life. Anyway,
and I will say that in the course of this national tour you're doing with Steal the Story, there's beautiful social media photos of that. He's no longer a young man. He's a man. Daniel is, you met him. He came to a screening.
This was unbelievable. Well, first I have to credit Dennis Moynihan, who is the Special Projects Coordinator at Democracy Now!, who's been with us almost from the beginning. And none of this would be possible without Dennis, because, I mean, I am talking to you from Belfast, Northern Ireland, and we're broadcasting from a TV studio here. We were just in Sheffield in England, and Democracy Now! Has broadcast live from this little TV station, community TV station, for 14 years. He found it. He got in touch with them. He hired a TV broadcast van to come to the studio. And I'm doing this again tomorrow at Northern Vision in Belfast, which aired us for years before they sold their license. And now they do special podcast shows. It's amazing to be with community media activists around the world as we travel. And Dennis is an amazing researcher. And he tracked down Daniel, and it turns out he lives in the same city Dennis lives in Denver, Colorado. And he was coming back from, I think it was Barcelona, the night before we were premiering at the C Cinema in Denver. And he came with his fiance. And it was so touching. I peered over in the dark cinema and I saw the light reflected in their faces as he saw this young Daniel asking me questions. And when he came out, he said, where was my tooth?" He was missing a tooth, but it was really so moving to be with him. And yes, our Jewish education was a great inspiration to me. You know, our grandfather, who we called Zaidi, was an Orthodox rabbi. He ran the Crown Heights Yeshiva. And when our mom was bad in the Crown Heights Yeshiva, she was sent to the principal, and he would say, "Dadala, what did you do wrong? Why are you here in the principal's office?" And
Very,
we
very good Zadie accent, by the way.
yes. He went to the Slobodka Yeshiva, which was a famous yeshiva in Kovno, Lithuania. And me and you, David, and Mom, and your daughter, Ariel, got to go there and visit the area. The yeshiva was destroyed. But that was an amazing experience to go back there. And he went there when he was 9 years old. He left in the right around 1920, when he was about 20. And he and our grandmama, came to fleeing the pogroms, came to the United States. It was well before the Holocaust, but those in the family who didn't leave, a number of them died in the Holocaust. And I got a chance with Dennis Moynihan after we cover the UN Climate Summit every year. And years ago, it was in Katowice, Poland. And it's actually where where the film begins, and that's chasing Donald Trump's sort of sole representative in Katowice. His family owned a gas station in Alabama, and I was trying to ask him why he was pushing coal at this climate summit when this was soon after the Paris Climate Agreement that came out of the Paris UN Climate Summit, and he refused to answer my questions. But after that climate summit, it was also the place where we got to broadcast Greta Thunberg's voice for the first time. At the time, a 15-year-old climate activist. It was an amazing experience. And then I saw Trump's envoy right after the show, and we went chasing him. But then Dennis and I flew to Lviv in what is now Ukraine, and got to go to Rivne, where our grandmother, Sonia Bach, was born in 1897. And she was a woman of 3 centuries. She lived until she was 108, died in Brooklyn, New York, in Long Beach, at the age, as I said, of 108. She lived in 3 different centuries, and she was a remarkable woman. She inspired me, as our other grandparents did. And, most importantly, it was to question. That's what our family dinners were, our Shabbos dinners. I remember we would invite friends over and they'd say, "You don't just eat, you're like fighting, you're arguing, you're talking." And I thought that's what a meal was. And that's how we grew up, is to question everything. I would question Zaidi, our grandfather, the rabbi, all the time. Like, "I'm going to go into the shul with you, Zaidi, and I'm going to pray next to you." And he would say, "No, no, Amala, you're going upstairs. The women are upstairs." "Why, Zaidi? We're equal. Why can't we be next to each other? We're family." And, through all of our family, we learn not only to deeply question, but to deeply care, that a life well lived mattered. It was certainly the case with our beloved parents. And that's how I try to lead my life. As you lead your life, Dave.
And of course, both our dad is known to people who rode the Long Island Railroad in the 1980s as the face of the concerned doctor holding a stethoscope with the picture of a mushroom cloud saying, "Your doctor is worried." It hangs right next to me where I'm talking to you because he was one of the founders of the Long Island chapter of the Physicians for Social Responsibility. And our mom was also involved in that.
Yeah.
So,
And you're right. And it actually hangs in my office as well. Your doctor is worried. He looked exactly like Peter Sellers. And he said the hardest part of doing that photo shoot was not smiling. And Mom started the Long
well,
Island
there was another
chapter.
hard part. He had to furrow his brow, and he said it gave him a headache because he was furrowing for the photographer for hours on end. So I always think of that, and I see his poor furrowed brow, and I think, poor guy needs an aspirin.
But Mom founded the Long Island chapter of Sane Freeze. They were deeply concerned about nuclear war, as we have to be today.
I know that an inflection point in your life, and both professionally and personally, was when you survived a massacre in East Timor in 1991. Few people had ever even heard of East Timor unless they'd gone to a talk by Noam Chomsky, which we both had in Cambridge. He was one of the few people, the great social critic and linguist, he was one of the few people writing about this place where there was a genocide underway. Talk about what happened there and how did it change you and influence everything you've done since?
I went to East Timor in 1990 and 1991 with my colleague, a great journalist named Alan Nairn. And when we went, and I mean, what we found was a true hell on earth. It was 300 miles above Australia. It was occupied by Indonesia, invaded. They invaded East Timor December 7th, 1975. 90% of their weapons were from the United States. The army was Indonesian army trained, financed, and armed by the United States. And they killed off a third of the population of East Timor. 200,000 people. And when we went there the second time in 1991, there was supposed to be a UN delegation that was going to come to investigate the human rights situation. We later learned it was at the behest of the United States that that delegation never came. But people dropped out of workplaces, their homes, their schools, so that they would be able to talk to the delegation, and they would go into churches because Catholic churches, it's a Catholic country, was one of the few places they could be protected. But when the delegation just was canceled, they had no place to turn. It was November 12th, 1991, that we heard there was going to be a march from the main Catholic church in Dili, the capital of East Timor, to the cemetery where so many young people were buried, the Santa Cruz Cemetery. There were so many people that went to the church for Mass before the march that they held the communion outside, the priests. And then people unfurled banners from their Catholic school blouses that they had packed into, hidden away, that said, when they pulled them out, they were written on bed sheets. Why the Indonesian military shoot our church? They appealed to President. It was George H.W. Bush at the time. And they pleaded for someone to care. And they marched to the cemetery. We were interviewing people, asking them why they were willing to risk their lives. And at the cemetery, we saw the Indonesian soldiers carrying their USM-16s at the ready position, marching up 10 to 12 abreast. Alan and I decided to walk to the front of the crowd, although we knew they killed many Timorese. before, we thought maybe we could stop this attack just by our presence as Western journalists, since that was so rare. I held up my microphone like a flag. Alan put the camera above his head, and we stood in the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up without any warning, without any hesitation, without any provocation. They just passed us, and they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. Then a group of them came at me. I had my microphone up like a flag. They beat me to the ground. Alan threw himself on top of me to protect me from further injury, and they put the guns to our heads. They took their US M16s first, though, and they slammed them against Alan's skull like baseball bats until they fractured it. And then they put the guns to our heads. And they were shouting, "Are you from Australia?" We knew how dangerous that was because there were 5 Australian journalists 17 years before covering the events leading to the invasion. They had executed them all, and the Australian government hardly protested. We believe because they would divide up the oil in the Timor Gap with Indonesia. They hardly complained at the time about what happened. So we made very clear we're from America, America. And at some point, they took the guns from our heads. They would have to pay a price for killing us. They'd never had to pay for killing the Timorese. They killed more than 270 Timorese on that day. It was horrifying beyond belief. It affects me every day to this day. We were able to get into a Red Cross Jeep. We were not able to stop that massacre. Dozens of Timorese jumped on top of us to flee this killing field, and we drove like that as a human mass to the hospital. When we got there, the doctors and nurses started to cry when they saw us, because I think of what we represent to the people, not only of East Timor, not only us, but Western journalists, people from the West. 2 things. I think we represent to people even beyond East Timor as the most powerful country on earth, both the sword. The U.S. all too often either supports human rights abusing regimes or uses the weapons themselves, like they do in Iran right now, but also the shield. They see the American people as the shield. And that day, that shield was bloodied, and it just deepened their despair. We moved on from the hospital. We were able to get to the airport. We were able to get to a flight. We knew the only way we could stop the killing was to get word to the outside world. We flew on to West Timor and to Bali, which is considered a paradise on earth. There we got on at the time, a continental flight. And before we got on that flight, we used the phone and we said a massacre has been committed in East Timor. And when we got to Washington, after Alan was treated at the local hospital, we held a news conference in the National Press Club and said the Indonesian army used US M16s. We were connected to this country through the barrel of a gun. A nationwide movement grew up in the United States. 8 years later, in 1999, the UN sponsored a referendum, and the people of East Timor voted for their freedom. And in 2002, after being run by the UN for 3 years, they became one of the newest nations in the world, the Republic of Timor-Leste, of East Timor. And we were able to go back on that night when they celebrated. And you could see the tear-stained faces of the surviving population looking up at the fireworks display this day of their independence. And they had a lesson to teach us all. And that is, we have a decision to make every day whether we want to represent the sword or the shield.
I want to turn to this week. You have been raising the red flag and warning about the threat of media consolidation, of censorship, of how so few corporations are now controlling the media. And this week, we come to the incredible development that Paramount is buying Warner Brothers for $100 billion with just, countless media properties that fall within that. CBS, HBO, Comedy Central, just about half the things on your dial. So you've been warning and talking about this. We've been warning about this in the 4 books we've written. The first one was The Exception to the Rulers, exposing oily politicians, war profiteers, and the media that love them. So we've had our eye on this. But I think this week is when it perhaps breaks into common consciousness. And we see it, in the takeover of 60 Minutes. Which, was sort of the soundtrack to our Sundays growing up. We were always, if Dad wasn't watching the Knicks, go Knicks, we were watching 60 Minutes. And now we come to this moment when they have fired most of the correspondents, and these senior, the voice of God, people always called Cronkite, Scott Pelley, these baritone men and women as well, who, have come to be our trusted kind of voices of the news and there's Scott Pelley saying they had their thumb on the scale, telling news the way the Trump administration wanted it. Do you think the moment we're in is just a continuation of the struggle that you've been talking about, or are we in a new stage of open repression of the media and journalism?
Well, yes, I do think it's a new phase. I think it's been incremental. But when you have a president who's calling the media the enemy of the people, and you have the heads of the networks going on bended knee, doing everything they can to please him, rather than be a true fourth estate, which is what will save a democracy, it is a very big problem. Now, here I wanted to bring in the directors of Steal the Story plays, the Oscar-nominated directors, Tia Lesson and Carl Deal. And I'm really excited to be with you, David, and with Carl as we travel through Vermont to all the theaters from Montpelier to Burlington to Brattleboro to St. Johnsbury on the weekend, because they are 2 amazing directors. They were Oscar nominated for their film on Hurricane Katrina called Trouble the Water. Tia just won 3 Emmys for her film, The Janes, about the underground Chicago abortion network in the 1960s. They were Michael Moore's producers. And they have signed on to a petition, along with hundreds, I think it's thousands now, actually, of producers, directors, actors, called Block the Merger. They don't think it's a done deal, even though the Justice Department just signed off on this merger between Warner Brothers Discovery and Paramount Skydance, which would bring together, right? Paramount owns CBS, which runs 60 Minutes, the gutted 60 Minutes. And Warner Brothers has HBO and CNN. So it would put CBS, CNN, HBO, and other media properties under one roof, under the roof of the owners, the billionaire Trump allies, Larry Ellison and his son, David Ellison, who just had a dinner honoring President Trump. But they have signed, Tia and Carl, an open letter trying to block this merger. And so have the executive producers of Steal the Story, Please, Jane Fonda and Rosario Dawson. Jane Fonda, of course, the famous actress who has revived her father's 1947 committee for the First Amendment, Henry Fonda. He formed it in 1947 to take on the House Un-American Activities Committee and the McCarthy era. Jane has now founded it, revived the committee, just had a big event at Town Hall with Bette Midler and Joan Baez and others in New York City, because she sees the need for it 80 years later. But they don't see this as a done deal. They're encouraging the the state attorneys general from California to New York to challenge this merger when you have only a few owners of most of the media. This is a real threat to democracy. When you're cutting down the number of voices you're going to hear, there's a reason we have a First Amendment. And the most important part of freedom of the press is the public's right to know. That's how you have a meaningful democracy. And that's why President Trump is suing media networks right to left, from CBS to ABC. Here I am in Northern Ireland to BBC. I mean, it is astounding. And in the last few weeks, this is no laughing matter, right? Stephen Colbert had his last show on CBS. And when he was told by CBS he would have his last show, it was last year. A week later, Trump's FCC approved the merger between Skydance and Paramount. And when did he ultimately lose his show? Just in the last few weeks, right before the Justice Department approved this $111 billion merger between Warner Brothers Discovery and Paramount. These are very serious times. But, and you know, Dave, because you were there, I have great hope. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary at Democracy Now! At the Riverside Church in Harlem. And it was March 23rd. It was really set for February 23rd, but there was the one-day snowpocalypse. And so we couldn't hold it then. I was afraid someone would slip. So we had to put off 2,000 people, but they waited a month. And on March 23rd, we gathered at that revered Sanctuary of Dissent, Riverside Church, where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his speech against the Vietnam War a year to the day before he was assassinated, April 4th, 1967. He said, "My country is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth today." And that was the United States. The corporate media, Life magazine, I have the issue, said he had done a disservice to his cause, his country, his people for speaking out against the Vietnam War, that his speech sounded like a script out of Radio Hanoi. He just doubled down. He said, you have to connect materialism, militarism, and racism. And he would be dead 1 year later. We went to this revered place, and Juan Gonzalez flew in. We've been co-hosting this show together for the full 30 years, and he talked about his history, and Tia and Carl do such a beautiful job showing that history in Steal the Story, Please. Juan started the New York chapter of the Young Lords, this the Puerto Rican equivalent of the Black Panthers. And the inner circle of the Young Lords, Juan described how the most important thing they understood as they made the white leadership of New York City tremble downtown was that they had to control their own narrative. And, Juan and his colleagues at the Young Lords, they became some of the leading reporters of New York over the years. And then Hooray for the Riff Raff sang Palante, which was the name of the Young Lords newspaper, Ever Forward. Nermeen Sheikh, our co-host, also gave a brilliant speech about expanding the frame to include the majority of people, and not only bringing them into the frame, but centering their voices. Masab Abu Toha, the great Palestinian poet, read his poem Under the Rubble. He just won the Pulitzer Prize. Angela Davis talked about the importance of dissent. Patti Smith sang Peaceable Kingdom. And we wrapped up with Bruce Springsteen singing Streets of Minneapolis. And then they all came up on the stage and sang Patti's iconic song, People Have the Power. And that really is the theme of Democracy Now! The idea that movements matter, that we have to go to where the silence is as journalists. And, it's not often silent. It's raucous, it's rowdy, people are organizing, but it doesn't hit the corporate media radar screen. That's where Democracy Now! Lives. And that's really where the hope is. When people are involved in social justice, they build a foundation. You never know when the magic moment comes, but if that foundation is there, they will make history. They will help determine the future. And we want to be there recording what those people, the majority of people in this country and around the world, because I really do think they're not a fringe minority, people who care about war and peace, climate change, reproductive rights, LGBTQ issues, racial and economic equality, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back.
So, Amy, 30 years. And over those 30 years, you have gone to some of the places where the light is dimmest around the world, often putting your own self in danger, which, as your brother always have to say, makes me nervous.
I know you told the story in the film, which is very
But
funny.
I mean, I'm going to forget some of them, but, going to Nigeria to tell the story, bring back the story of Chevron's, as you called it, drilling and killing, the exploitation of Nigerians in pursuit of oil, going to the Western Sahara to tell the story of the people there under Moroccan occupation, to go to cover the Republican convention in Minneapolis, where you and your team were arrested for simply trying to tell the news, to flying with Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide as he was being kidnapped, as he said, and being flown from Haiti to Africa by American operatives. So many stories over 30 years. I have to ask, what are you proudest of?
Being your sister, being an aunt, being a journalist who deeply cares about showing the images, ensuring that people's voices get heard, working with a team of people, that brain trust that is Democracy Now! My colleagues are my heroes. It's community media for a reason. I love community. I love my family. And I deeply believe that when people can enjoy justice and equality and community, that's where we thrive. And I want to try in my lifetime to make sure that as many people have that chance as possible. I do believe another world is possible.
Well, Amy, I know I'm so proud of you and love you, and hope that you stay out of harm's way even as you tell these important stories. But thank you for 30 years of speaking truth to power and of being my sister.
The feeling is mutual. Thank you, Dave.
Amy Goodman is the host and executive producer of the daily independent news program Democracy Now!, and she's my sister. She's featured in a new documentary film, Steal This Story Please, that is premiering around Vermont in Burlington, Brattleboro, St. Johnsbury, and Montpelier this week. That does it for this week's Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. Thanks so much for listening.